Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Geopolitics, the long game. Power, money, and the world they don't want you to know. In the first episode, we did an overview of geopolitics, and in episode 2, we looked at the continued importance of the Mackinder-Spikeman maps and their strategies to control the world. Today, we look at the empire. Now, most people follow the news the way a spectator watches a single move on the chessboard. Something happens, a crisis, a war, an election, an economic shock. And then something else happens. The connection between the moves is unclear. The pattern is invisible because nobody has shown them the reasoning behind the move. A student of the long game pulls back and looks at the full position. What looks like chaos from one square is, from the right elevation, a recognizable pattern. It has logic. It has history. And if you know what you're looking for, you can find it before the next move is made. Empires follow this pattern. There is a sequence, an irregularity in the play that precedes every collapse in recorded history. The Romans, the British, the Soviet system followed it. And if you know what an empire actually is, not as a political idea, but as a structured game with rules, players, and a predictable endgame, you can see it too. Today, we open the rulebook of empire, the one that was never published, what it is, how the game is structured, and what happens when a player starts making moves that cost more than they return. This is a long game. Let us understand the rules. So, what is an empire? The word itself carries enormous freight, with conquest, oppression, flags being planted, people subjugated. All of that is real, but it is the visible surface. It is what the empire presents to the outside world. In the long game, an empire is something more precise. It is a system for extracting resources from a periphery and concentrating them at the center. That is the game. Everything else, the ideology, the military, the cultural prestige, the trade agreements, the international institutions, these are the moves through which that game is being played. But the core objective is always the same. Resources flow inward, power and protection outward. The periphery is kept just stable enough to keep producing. Empires do not need to call themselves empires. Rome called itself a republic for centuries while running an imperial system. Britain called itself a civilizing mission. The United States calls itself a rules-based order. The name above the door tells you nothing. You need to read the moves being made inside. Chris Hedges, a Pulitzer-winning war correspondent, says the United States is not a democracy that occasionally goes to war. It is a militarized empire that holds elections. The elections are real, but they do not change the fundamental operating mechanism. That is a hard thing to hear if you grew up in the American or European Western tradition. But look at the component parts. 750-odd military bases in 80 countries, a defense budget larger than the next 10 nations combined, a financial system, the dollar, SWIFT, the IMF, that is all structured to ensure resources flows benefit the center. These are not the components of a republic minding its own business. They are the components of an imperial system. The question is not whether this system exists. The question is, how does it run? And how does it fail? Every imperial system throughout history operates across 4 dimensions. 3 are active strategies, but 1 is a process that no empire designs, but every empire eventually experiences: decay. The first dimension is military reach. Empires require a credible threat, a periodic demonstration of overwhelming force. This is what keeps the periphery producing and competitors at bay. Without it, the position collapses almost immediately. The Roman legions, the Royal Navy, the US carrier strike groups. Same strategy, different century. The second dimension is financial architecture. Every empire needs a mechanism that makes its currency, its debt instruments, and its trade terms the default for international system. This is what allows the empire to run deficits, to fund wars, and sustain its military reach, without immediately inflating itself to death. Britain did this through sterling and the gold standard. The United States currently runs it through the dollar and the petrodollar system. Financial architecture is a dimension most people never think about. It is also the dimension currently under the most severe stress. The third dimension is ideological legitimacy. Raw force is expensive and unstable. A mature empire converts force into consent. It projects an idea, civilization, democracy, rule-based order, Rudyard Kipling's white man's burden, that makes the periphery internalize the logic of its own subordination. When this works, the empire advances almost frictionlessly. When it fails, when the periphery stops believing the idea, the cost of maintaining position rises sharply. The fourth is institutional decay, the silent erosion of the structures built to constrain imperial power. The United Nations, IMF, the World Bank, WTO. These were all designed after 1945 to function as genuine international architecture, but rot and decay does not announce itself. It forms in the recesses where nobody looks, in voting structures weighted toward the powerful, in conditionality requirements that serve creditors over debtors, in enforcement mechanisms that apply to the weak and exempt the strong. Lawrence Wilkerson, who spent decades inside that system as Colin Powell's chief of staff, calls it the permanent architecture of American primacy. It was built to look neutral. It was not built to be neutral. And like all institutional decay, by the time it is visible on the surface, the structural damage underneath is already severe. 4 dimensions: military reach, financial architecture, ideological legitimacy, and institutional decay. When the first 3 are operating in sync and the decay is contained, the empire is nearly invincible. But institutional decay is never fully contained. It only slows or accelerates, and when it reaches a critical point, the stress transfers suddenly and silently to the dimensions around it. That is when the positions collapse. Not with a warning, but with a bang. Every imperial system has a breaking point, a position beyond which the cost of maintaining the periphery exceeds the resources being extracted from it. Historians call this imperial overextension. Strategists call it a losing position. The result is the same: dimensional failure in sequence. Edward Gibbon spent 6 volumes documenting how Rome reached that point. The legions became too expensive to maintain. The tax base of the periphery was squeezed until it stopped producing. The barbarian federates, who had been used as cheap military labor, began demanding a share of what they were defending. The financial architecture failed. Then, the ideological idea of Rome lost its grip. Then, the institutional decay reached the structural level, and the institutions became factions, fighting each other for the remaining resources. The sequence took centuries, but the strategic logic was consistent. Chalmers Johnson, a former CIA consultant and one of the most important American strategic thinkers of the late 20th century, spent the last decade of his life documenting the same sequence in the American system. His trilogy, Blowback, The Sorrows of Empire, and Nemesis, is essentially a strategist's account of a position that has overreached. His argument is that the United States after 1991 made a critical error. Rather than drawing down its imperial infrastructure after the Soviet threat collapsed, it expanded it. New bases, new interventions, new commitments. The cost of maintaining position increased. The financial architecture was put under additional strain. The ideological legitimacy, the democracy promotion idea, was exposed as selective and self-serving by, for example, the Iraq War, and the institutional decay accelerated. International institutions were bypassed whenever their rulings were inconvenient. Lawrence Wilkerson sat inside that decision-making process. He helped prepare Colin Powell's 2003 United Nations presentations, the one that made the case for invading Iraq on the basis of weapons of mass destruction that did not exist. His testimony is not that of a critic from outside the system. It is a testimony of a senior player who watched the position of failure happen in real time, from the inside, and who understands exactly which move began the deterioration. He says, "The game is still being played, but anyone who knows what to listen for can hear the clock running down." So, what does an empire losing its position actually sound like? What are the specific signals a trained observer reads? The first signal is the legitimacy fracture. This is when the ideological dimension begins to fail. You see it when the gap between stated values and actual behavior becomes too wide to paper over. Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, the drone program, the surveillance revelations of Edward Snowden, Julian Assange. Each of these was not just a scandal. Each was a fracture, a moment when the periphery and significant parts of the domestic population stopped believing the idea. When an empire has to spend more energy explaining why it is not what it appears to be, the ideological position is lost. The second signal is financial stress. This is when the financial architecture shows strain. You see it in the persistent trade deficits, in the weaponization of the dollar through sanctions, which then accelerates the search for alternative systems, in the BRIC nations accumulating gold and building alternative payment systems, in the arithmetic of a national debt that now exceeds annual economic output. The financial position is not lost, but it is weaker than its architects intended. The third signal is political fracture, the most dangerous of the three. This is when the institutional decay reaches the domestic political system itself, when institutions fight each other rather than serving the public interest, when the gap between the political class and the population it normally serves becomes structural rather than cyclical, when a figure like Donald Trump, whatever you might think of him, can reach the presidency twice, in part, by pointing at the system and saying, "Can you see that? Something is wrong here." Chris Hedges argues that this political fracture is terminal, that American democracy has already been hollowed out by corporate capture to the point where the institutional decay is structural, not cosmetic. Wilkinson is more cautious. He thinks the system still has resilience, but the window for repair is narrowing. Neither of them saying that the empire is about to collapse. Empires can sustain a losing position for a long time. Rome managed it for 2 centuries. But a losing position does not correct itself. And the longer it persists, the more it damages the dimensions around it. That is where we are. That is the state of the board. And now you have the framework to read it. In February 2003, Colin Powell addresses the United Nations Security Council. He presents satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and source intelligence, all purporting to show that Iraq possesses weapons of mass destruction. It is a very polished, authoritative performance. It moves votes. It provides the political fuel for an invasion. Lawrence Wilkinson was in that room. He helped prepare the presentation. He has since described it as the most shameful moment of his professional life. What was documented internally at the time was that the intelligence was not solid, that the sourcing was thin. Remember Tony Blair and the highly questionable British intelligence papers? That the case had been assembled to reach a predetermined conclusion. The move was visible to anyone inside the system, but it was already in play and no one with the authority to stop it was willing to act. The Iraq war cost, by a conservative estimate, 100,000 civilian lives, $2 trillion, and the ideological legitimacy that had powered American imperial expansion since 1945. One fabricated move, 3 of the 4 strategic dimensions took damage they have not really fully recovered from. In the notation of the long game, a blunder is a move that sacrifices positional advantage for no lasting gain. The Iraq gambit cost military credibility, financial resources, and ideological legitimacy, and produced a result that strengthened Iran's regional position, destabilized the Middle Eastern board for a generation, and left the player weaker than before the move. The notation is there. Anyone who wants to read The Long Game can find it. In episode 4, The Deep State, Myth or Machine, we go looking for the permanent players, the institutional forces that keep the long game running, regardless of which leader is normally in charge. Now, if today's episode sharpened the way you see power, subscribe, comment, and share, as the more people who can read the board, it makes the long game harder to play without scrutiny. I'm Richard. This is The Long Game. Next episode, we find the component that keeps the game running, regardless of who thinks they are in charge, the permanent machinery beneath elected power.